Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Centering the Forgotten Women, Strategies to Empower Rural Women in Low and Middle Income Nations. My name is Kinanti Anjani, but you can call me Kin. I'm a second-year student in the Elliott School of International Affairs, and I will be moderating this event. This panel will focus on the importance of women in rural communities in dismantling the gendered status quo. We have opening remarks from Professor Qureshi here, who had taught us all in a very impactful Women in Global Politics class last semester.
I'm taking your guess. That's over to me now, since you've now mentioned my name. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. And I am Professor Qureshi, and I also want to thank everybody for participating in this seminar today. I have the great honor to be able to have taught these amazing students last semester as part of the Women in Global Politics course. The Women in Politics course essentially is an overview of the global status of women, really focusing on the discrepancies between normative frameworks and policies developed to benefit women and the actual implementation of these policies worldwide. The course really focused on examining political, economic, and cultural religious frameworks, but also overall the effects on the well-being of women and the status of women worldwide, and some of the impediments that really limit the access to these key resources. We also kind of focused on feminism as well as a feminist international relations theory and paying attention to where and how women are included and excluded from the decision-making process worldwide, both in terms of civil society organizations, government entities, and the broader multilateral space. In this specific case, we had a memo that was really focused on this year's CSW, CSW 88, I believe, or 68. I never know which number it is. And as a parallel event, we submitted the top papers from our course. And from there, we chose the top papers and that were really thought-provoking and came from Autumn Carpenter, Eleanor Greenbaum, Saravi Kumar, and Devorah Schwartz. They touch really on various different topics, and they will introduce it to themselves, but they really do range from very vital topics and areas ranging from combating gang violence to the state-led violence against Iranian women, to rural healthcare and equitable public healthcare access, and of course, and last but not least, gender-based violence in India. All of these areas and the policies that they push forward with exceptional research really highlight the forward thinking of the next generation and key students that are really exemplary at the Elliott School of International Affairs. But before I talk too long, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Kinanti, Kin, because I chose you as a moderator because you're fantastic at it and was also an amazing student of mine last semester. So I'm gonna cut myself off, hand it back over to you, and so you guys can then jump into these amazing papers and this wonderful panel. Thank you so much, ladies. I miss you all.
Thank you, Professor. We are all very excited for the panelists to share their findings from their papers. Can the panelists share their names and a description of their papers, starting with Eleanor?
Hi all, my name is Eleanor Greenbaum. I'm a senior in the Elliott School. I'm studying international affairs with a concentration in conflict resolution and a minor in political science. I'm really looking forward to learning how our unique topics align and differ in today's panel. My paper discusses the importance of economic empowerment for female farmers in the Sahel region of Africa, particularly in the face of the climate crisis. Sahelian women, despite being major contributors to agricultural outputs, lack access to many economic resources, agricultural education, and land ownership. My proposed solutions aim to boost women's economic empowerment and knowledge systems with a climate-sensitive lens by enriching existing programming to promote sustainable agricultural entrepreneurship and leadership.
Thank you, Eleanor. Hi, everyone. My name is Devorah Schwartz, and I'm a third-year student studying international affairs with a concentration in economics and a minor in art history. And I'm so excited to be here today with my co-panelists, and I'm really looking forward to discussing the ways that intersectionality plays a role in envisioning the solutions and recommendations that we have brought here today, specifically on gender-based issues. And my paper discusses the empowerment of women in the agricultural industry, but in the Horn of Africa, who are facing the extremities of climate change and severe drought. And I explore the ways that women-led financing solutions can simultaneously accommodate the integration of climate-adaptive agrotechnology and boost the economic mobility of the women and their communities.
Thank you, Devora and Eleanor. Hello everyone. My name is Survi Kumar. I am a fourth-year undergraduate student studying international affairs with a double concentration in security policy and gender and international affairs with a minor in political science. I'm looking forward to hearing solutions and initiatives from my co-panelists on addressing gender inequality in various parts of the world. My paper discusses the dual issue of high rates of intimate partner violence and low rates of female literacy rates in the rural states of India. I discuss various policy initiatives that the government of India can implement that take into account the correlation between these two issues in rural India, such as investing in state-level ministries of education and updating the education system to include gender issues.
Thank you, my fellow panelists. I do want to preface that if you all hear construction, I'm so sorry. That started like a minute ago. But also, my name is Autumn Carpenter, and I'm a sophomore at GW. I have a concentration in gender at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and I think I'm probably going to pursue like a minor in film, but that is pending. My paper discusses how women in rural and mountainous regions of Colombia kind of use the cocaine industry as a way to support their livelihood and like support their family's well-being. So my paper kind of addresses solutions to make sure that women are able to kind of do whatever work they pursue in this industry safely and equitably. And we'll get into like the different solutions that I propose later.
Thank you very much, everyone. In order to ensure that all the important topics are covered in the panel today, we will be organizing the panels in terms of themes. There will be 4 themes. Theme 1 is intersectionality and gender policy. Theme 2 is the underrepresentation of reporting on issues for rural women. Theme 3 is using resources to help women empower themselves. And theme 4 is accountability measures. Each theme will have a focus question that will instigate a conversation among the panelists. Please keep in mind that questions are welcome. There is a Q&A box and will be answered at the end of the panel. Before we start the panel, we would like to define intersectionality as it is an important term for the entire panel. Kimberly Crenshaw, which is an American civil rights advocate, has described intersectionality as the overlapping of external oppression of people in society which includes class, sexual orientation, age, and ability. This represents the unique vulnerabilities that people are faced with. Let us start with theme 1, which is intersectionality and gender policy. The focus question is, when we speak about gender-sensitive policy, intersectionality arises as a key theme. How did you all incorporate an intersectional lens in your research and policy recommendations? And why is intersectionality important for stakeholders to include in their standards for cooperation? Saravi has an interesting take on this question, which is based on her paper in India. Take it away.
Thank you, Ken. When I think about intersectionality in the context of my case study, India, I think of the numerous intersections that make up the country's diversity, such as ethnicity, caste, religion, socioeconomic status, location, and so much more. But the biggest intersection that I had focused on in my paper was the rural intersection when it came to understanding the correlation between intimate partner violence and female literacy rates. Based on my research, I found that rates of intimate partner violence were much higher in rural states than they were in urban states. And when I looked at female literacy rates, I found that it was lower in rural states than it was in urban states. And based on this, I found that there was a linkage between these issues in the context of rural India. I had also analyzed the cultural, caste, and religious intersections as well, but they played more of a role in the prevalence and underreporting of intimate partner violence and the low literacy rates amongst women and girls. I found it critical to include the relevant intersections in my analysis and policy recommendations as they play a part in, one, understanding the dual issues in the context of these intersections, but in also creating policies that will keep in mind women of all backgrounds.
Yeah, I found that particularly interesting. I think within all our papers, but within my paper, and I can connect to this to Saravi's paper as well, I saw like a really huge disparity between like the rural to urban intersection. Like historically within Colombia, a lot of like government policies and infrastructure doesn't really reach rural areas in the same capacity. And I thought that was something that was pretty common across all our papers, to be honest. But a factor that was like uniquely that I wanted to highlight within my paper was that there's kind of like a racial aspect or racial component, a racial intersection on top of like the class and location disparity. Typically people within the rural parts of Colombia are either of African descent or indigenous descent. So they've had a long time in proximity to a lot of like the cocaine plants, the coca plant specifically. And I feel like whenever it comes to like the government kind of addressing this issue or trying to make sure that people are like not within the industry or even just engaging with people in general that are a part of it, they tend to do so harshly. And I'm not saying this is because of like a targeted, intentional like racial component, but I'm saying there's probably like an embedded system because of like the dual intersection and how like wealth and like race kind of plays a part in Colombia. I do think that now a lot of this is a lot of this is being highlighted, especially now, not with like the spread of like globalization and how people are addressing like racial issues in their own countries, but the current vice president is a Afro-Colombian woman, and so she has come from like these regions, and so she understands and kind of is like acting as like a representative, and is kind of like highlighting how like this embedded like institutionalization uniquely affects like women within this industry, especially Afro-Indigenous women, like who like have to face both the systems of like oppression in that case. I think then you like kind of couple this with like the paramilitary and like guerrilla groups and like even the country's military that are fighting within the regions, and it kind of develops even more. But I don't think conflict is like uniquely a unique intersection to like my paper. I feel like other panelists could also speak on this. Yeah, thank you, Autumn. I really appreciate what both my fellow panelists mentioned as far as the urban-rural divide. Within that divide in the Sahel, there is also another divide between farmer and pastoralist communities. The conflict between these two communities, largely over resources as they become increasingly scarce with the climate crisis, is a huge point of discussion in the climate space in the Sahel. The communities have different livelihoods, lifestyles, sources of income, which means that policies directed towards each must be unique and account for those differences. Because my focus in my paper was on economic empowerment for female farmers, the resources I discuss and I will discuss later are more focused towards them. However, it's important to remember that these pastoralist communities exist as well, and their well-being is often overlooked within rural portions of the Sahel. Thus, when we're considering providing resources for women to effectively participate in climate-friendly farming that will economically benefit them, it's important to remember that the existence of these pastoralist communities and women within those pastoralist communities.
And kind of circling back to what Survi mentioned earlier about the prevalence of the caste system in India, that kind of resonated with my research, which integrated class as an aspect of intersectionality, and the way that low-income women who are involved in small share agriculture in the Horn of Africa are impacted. And so class, really plays a pretty important part in intersectionality because of the way that money is so intertwined with privileges like economic mobility that are so important in empowering women. And for rural low-income women, they face significant hurdles to achieving economic empowerment, especially, in the case of the small share farmers that I researched. And there are barriers that they experience, both institutional and cultural, that bar them from property and financial rights. And on top of this, research suggests that climate change will disproportionately affect low-income women and girls, as well as the agricultural industry. So when you put those two things together, there can be a pretty catastrophic situation if we don't propose solutions to work through that and bring that aspect into our work. And so for me, understanding how class plays a role in intersectionality is really important to building these solutions that take into account the current financial realities of the world that we live in, but also, the challenges that it poses for these women who often have to devote immense time and energy just to make ends meet, which can really, harm their ability to make strides in other spheres of empowerment, like education. And so, everything is kind of interconnected, which, or intersectional, you could say. So, it plays a huge role in developing these really multifaceted solutions that take into account the complexities of the lives and the livelihoods of these women.
Thank you all. It is very visible that intersectionality can be seen in many different and similar ways throughout your different papers. Obviously, since we were in a class last semester, we've all understood that different aspects of intersectionality can be a privilege, and at the same time, a negative. So it is important to understand this term. Of course, all of these findings are based on the available data, which can be a challenge for us students, which brings in theme 2, which is the underrepresentation of reporting on issues for rural women. And the focus question is, in each of these cases, reporting measures are extremely limited. What barriers did you find in terms of researching statistics and testimonies for rural women? What could be some of the reasons that the challenges that rural women face often go unreported? Take it away, Autumn.
Yeah, so if I was to give like an overall impression of like when I was finding statistics and data on like women within like the cocaine industry in Colombia, it was kind of scarce. I'm not gonna lie. Finding statistics and testimonies were pretty difficult. Inherently, the way that I would like most of my findings essentially came from documents that were looked at like incarceration rates. So the UN had like kind of a comprehensive like list of like different incarceration rates within different countries, because like the cocaine industry like kind of bleeds over from Colombia to Argentina to Venezuela, and kind of looked at testimonies from a lot of women that were incarcerated. They also tended to be lighter skinned. We're bringing back like the racial like intersection here. But then when they were actually on the ground interviewing rural communities on like the issues of the cocaine industry and how like it impacts their community, a lot of the testimonies were taken from Indigenous men. And I do think like it was comprehensive. It did add to my paper, but again, it doesn't center women. And that's been like a reoccurring theme. So just to give like a mini overview of how the government kind of conducted a lot of this research, is there's like a substitution system in which they ask the rural Indigenous communities to and kind of substitute whatever cocaine crop they were doing to like maybe a coffee crop, for example. And so whenever the organization overheading this is called PNIS, by like the Drug Administration in Colombia, they typically ask like only men. And it's not like, and there's been a lot of concerns in recent years of how like it doesn't take a gendered perspective, because they're not really asking women how they're like also participating in this. And a lot of times women are on the ground, also planting the crops just as much as the men are. If anything, they probably have like more stake in it because they have like a like familial incentive to like provide for their families. Another thing that makes this also difficult with reporting is the changes in governments. Like there's been funding from some years, and then there's been less funding other years. There's been less incentive to focus on this some years. And it just depends on like how the government stance is on the cocaine industry in general. Some of them are much harsher. And so they're more willing to send in like military. And that's when you see like an increase in incarceration rates. This is all to say as well, like a lot of this data is like active reports on like the agricultural aspect, which is definitely important because like women are a part of it, but it kind of neglects how like, because a lot of women are also in the cocaine industry in the way that they are in the chemical labs, they're selling the drug, or they are actively a drug mule, which means they have to travel in between countries. So a lot of that data goes missing because the government is so willing and focusing on like the rehabilitation part of like switching and substituting the crops. They're not like analyzing any of the avenues, and instead of criminalizing women, which only pushes back the community even further. And this has like become cyclical. But yeah, I feel like this concludes like a summary of like my research gathering barriers, but I do think like this also could bleed over into other parts of the world.
Thank you, Autumn. Yeah, I think that one of the challenges that I experienced in data collection for my paper was kind of in a different vein, more in finding like case studies and examples of strategies that had been successfully implemented that, created some kind of change and hopefully lasting change. And, I found a lot of data on, climate patterns and drought patterns and crop productivity and all those kinds of topics, but none of them really centered women as the managers and main actors and stakeholders on these farms. And there isn't nearly enough reporting on these women who continue to work through these climate challenges and other things like conflict and the changes in productivity that they're experiencing, because changes in productivity affect their livelihoods and their income. And, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the intersection with class, and that if their livelihood is wiped out completely by a drought, where do we go from there? And, I think that it's important to recognize that, because women in agriculture often have decades and decades of experience and knowledge that's passed down through generations in agriculture about the land and different techniques. And so they're the greatest tool and resource that we have in developing solutions. And so by not talking to them, by not gathering testimonies and data about, their experience, we're only, harming the way forward and slowing ourselves down, because they're critical in ensuring that our data collection and research is actually pertinent to the things that they're experiencing. And so, I think that our solutions are really only as good as our understanding of the problem. So talking to women themselves, and really doing what we're saying in this panel and centering them in our research is critical to making the, our understanding of climate change and agroscience richer and more meaningful.
Yeah, thank you, Devora. My data collection process and the barriers I ran into were really similar with what Devora just discussed. I think it's clear with what you both talked about, but reporting in the Sahel is extremely limited due to lack of government reporting resources and the sheer decentralized nature of these more rural communities. Also, as many of you may know, the Sahel has undergone a series of coups and years of political instability, which has focused government and international aid away from development efforts, as Autumn kind of touched on earlier. Oftentimes when countries face this political instability, women's well-being is among the first things to be forgotten, unfortunately. So when researching, I definitely ran into some of these issues with the lack of reporting. It was difficult to find specific communities that had benefited from international development efforts, or if certain programs were still in service following periods of political instability. So I kind of focused more on trying to find broader regional statistics and larger programs that I could confirm were up and running or had previously been effective. I also think this leans a little bit into my policy recommendation aspect, improving monitoring and evaluation in communities that I'm going to talk about later, especially in communities that have historically been given aid and then abandoned, and especially during times of conflict, when it's more important than ever to be reporting on these rural communities' well-being, and specifically for my paper, how female farmers are faring agricultural outputs, especially during times of conflict, which is then compacted with climate change.
My co-panelists make great points on political instability, conflict, and lack of government resources being large causes of underreporting and the sheer lack of data. In the context of my paper, I found that a huge cause of underreporting and the lack of data on intimate partner violence and female literacy rates within rural India was the conservative and patriarchal values embedded in society. The rural states especially are understood to be much more conservative and patriarchal than urban states. And I found that it was essentially a cause and effect type of situation. Quote unquote progressive ideas such as allowing girls to go to school and talking about issues such as intimate partner violence often didn't resonate with rural societies and were often viewed as a threat to the patriarchal structure of the society. When access to education for girls is restricted, they're only exposed to the patriarchal ideas of their home and community, which pushes orthodox and dangerous rhetorics on issues that are considered to be quote unquote taboo, like intimate partner violence. In India, stigmatizing topics such as intimate partner violence are also understood to be private matters and shouldn't be discussed openly outside of the walls of one's home. The stigmatization of intimate partner violence, and the ostracization of women who do report these crimes or even speak up about them instills fear in other women, preventing them from reporting when they themselves are victims of intimate partner violence.
Thank you all. Part of increasing representation among rural women is the need for various resources. We have arrived at theme 3, which is using resources to help women empower themselves. The focus question for this theme is, how do your papers leverage available resources, including educational and financial assistance, and empower women from diverse backgrounds to overcome systematic barriers and achieve their goals? Devora here has emphasized her paper on financial and educational resources.
Thank you, Kin. Yeah, so I broke down both financial and educational resources in my research, and I found that they really do play off of each other, and if utilized properly, create a super dynamic means to empowerment. And so I think it really starts though with education and promoting access to quality education. And everything from literacy to mathematics is so important on the road to economic empowerment, which was, kind of the main goal of my paper. But specifically, though, I learned that there are varied understandings of things like climate change among women in agriculture and the small share farms, which can be super detrimental to their ability to have productive crops. Because if you're not prepared for the rapidly changing environment, your crops have a greater risk of failing. And so one of the suggestions and the policy recommendations that I made was to implement comprehensive climate and agri-science education, because, like I said earlier, these women possess decades of experience. And so ensuring their access to this kind of science and this education on the climate change specifically, they can make decisions for their farms and make sure that their strategies and techniques are only reinforced. Because I think one thing to stress is that we don't want to go in and say that they have to change everything, because they know what they need. And so I think that giving them more well-rounded understandings will just boost their productivity even more and go down the line and improve their economic mobility. And then also going into the financial side of things, money and finances are just a core part of empowering women in agriculture, because everything has a cost. Seeds, machinery, tools, and time is a cost as well. And as we've mentioned, there's so many systemic barriers and institutional barriers that prevent women from accessing formal financial institutions like banks. And if they can't get a loan, they can't get this, a tractor or a truck to take their produce to the market or something like that. And so figuring out how to leverage financial resources in a region where it's difficult for women to access these kinds of things. I found a great case study about a community in Santhi, Senegal, which basically was about how these women came together and invested in a VSLA, a voluntary savings and loan association, with their own money that they had already made from selling their crops and their produce. And as a result, they were able to invest together, which is a great way to spread risk. And they were able to purchase and install an entire drip irrigation system, which I can go into the details a little bit, is just a better way of watering the crops when there's water scarcity. And it saves a lot of time, because one of the most time-consuming and dangerous aspects of agriculture is collecting water. And so this was an excellent investment that they were able to procure themselves. And ultimately, the VSLA became a way to support other community investments. And so everybody was benefiting. And I think it was just a great example of the way that even in financially and economically restricted environments, women can actually be their own catalysts and solutions to economic empowerment. And it's not necessarily about coming in and doing something for them. It's about uplifting and figuring it out that way.
Yeah, thank you, Devorah. You kind of touched a lot on what I focused on as far as the importance of education and localizing funding. Luckily, the UN and other organizations like USAID have been recently funneling a lot of funding into climate change solutions, particularly after this year's COP28, which was held in Dubai in November. A lot of this funding has been aimed towards lower income nations with the goal of localizing climate action. It's mostly focused on loss and damage funding, but some of it is being leveraged for adaptation funding, which would be relevant for the purposes of my paper. While questions remain on this international climate funding as far as its effectiveness, I think it's certainly a step forward in that it gives existing resources a chance to be leveraged for women's economic empowerment. In my paper, similarly, I also talk a little bit about the Fund for Gender Equality, which is once again just a larger grant that can provide microloans or smaller scale financing for localized organizations. And then other than this larger climate or gender financing, a lot of what I looked into for my paper was improving and building on existing programming. So one example of this was the AgriFed program, which ran from 2016 to 2021 in rural Mali. It empowered 25,000 rural women to utilize climate smart agriculture through microfinance and skill building. The program was highly successful. 91% of women used these innovative practices and increased their production by 35%. So I think there is a way with increasing more direct funding and education initiatives to leverage existing programs, mostly sponsored by the UN, USAID, other development programs, to ensure that women have the tools for self-sufficiency and personal economic empowerment.
As both Devorah and Eleanor have mentioned, it is crucial for women to leverage the available resources to empower themselves to overcome gender-based discrimination and violence. When drafting policy recommendations for my paper, I place a heavy emphasis on the creation and support of government programs, since I proposed these recommendations to the government of India in my paper. I point out specific government institutions like the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare as primary institutions that would be charged with implementing the policy recommendations outlined in the paper. However, I would like to focus on my second policy recommendation that I outlined in my paper, which was applying a gender lens to the education system as a key policy. The Ministry of Education would be tasked to create a new curriculum that included gender-related topics such as gender inequality in various sectors and violence against women. However, this can be done with support from women-led civil society organizations that focus on addressing key issues like intimate partner violence, as well as organizations that encourage and support girls in attaining an education that also operate in rural India. I believe that this would be an effective way to include and empower women working on the ground in addressing these dual issues within rural India.
I think my paper, I tried to give a mix of both. The way that we can, I think right now they are leveraging existing programs, but I felt like because of the nature of my paper and the nature of the cocaine industry and how it is very criminalized, I kind of went out of left field in my solution. I think that it would do a benefit of decriminalizing and maybe installing even legalization efforts for the cocaine industry. I say this because I feel like it makes sense. To explain, I think with the case, whenever the Colombian government is able to I feel like when it comes to issues of cocaine and embedded problems of that deal with racism and class issues, especially in Colombia, as this has become a deep-seated problem, you do need a level of institutionalized change. And I feel like with the efforts to decriminalize and legalize cocaine, what this does is it allows the government to kind of move in on the cocaine industry and capitalize on making this an informal sector that they can police to some capacity. What this does, it takes away the risk of incarceration for women within Colombia, while also kind of enabling them to actually get paid by the government or be sponsored by the government and not have to fear for the job that they've been doing already.
the framework in which I approached my paper is like, I'm not going to fault women for leveraging whatever resource they had available, which at the time, and which for a lot of them was entering the cocaine industry, whether that is like something they actively made a choice or they were kind of coerced into it. It doesn't take away from like the circumstances that they are a part of. And I feel like this is the safest way and most equitable way women could actually be a part of this industry and make money. And it also gives the government like an avenue for making sure and knowing which direction and where cocaine is like kind of being taken, especially as this has like become a global problem, and why there's like a lot of international initiatives when it comes to like trying to like crack down on cocaine, for example. However, I do think that is a very difficult thing to implement. I do think it would take a lot of time, but I do touch on some existing resources. I've already mentioned like the substitution efforts that the government has already implemented. They've done this since 2017, and they've seen like significant progress. Around 20,000 families have been impacted. However, because of like deep-rooted issues of like embedded like racism, and then also like a history of like these mountainous regions not really wanting to cooperate with the government, it is quite difficult. And it is something where you have to prove that you're actively aiding in this effort, otherwise you won't get paid for it. So it does have like a lot of risk involved. However, I do think the best thing that would address like the issues of women going on right now is kind of reinvesting in NGO programs, specifically the Equality and Territorial Development for Rural Women. This was concluded and closed down in 2020, probably due to pandemic and like efforts of like funding. But what happened was it was a way to like bridge rural women and women that are in urban regions and kind of become like an information sharing space where they establish networks to kind of like educate women through like non-formal education programs, because like a lot of like the formal education and institutions that exist in the city do not reach like rural regions as easily. However, with this program, they'd be able to share and communicate. And then like because of this, women within rural regions kind of have access to jobs that they probably wouldn't have before. And it gives them like a level of like social mobility. And then finally, this would be a better way to kind of understand like the situation on the ground. Whereas like our only testimonies that we get from women are from incarcerated women on this issue. So I really think this would be a beneficial program to re-implement, as it had seen success prior to 2020.
Thank you so much, Autumn, for a very interesting take on the cocaine industry and its relation to women in the rural community. Part of a good recommendation is the measures imposed to place accountability, which brings in theme 4. The focus question is, women in rural areas are often subjected to more conservative socio-cultural norms that may limit their societal mobility. How can we utilize an intersectional lens to ensure that the resources we've been discussing today, including finances, education, and healthcare, are protected and accessible for women regardless of their marital status, income, wealth, and family background? Eleanor has an interesting take on this question that brings in the term intersectionality that we discussed earlier on in the panel. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important that we're circling back to using an intersectional lens here. Sahelian women face immense barriers in day-to-day life, owning very little agricultural land, lacking access to many markets, despite the fact that they produce immense agricultural labor. And I think it's really important that we ensure that each unique community receives the type of support they need depending on their different circumstances. One thing I'd like to reemphasize with this focus on accountability is the importance of monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems. With any larger international organization that implements a certain funding mechanism or educational initiative, it's incredibly important to ensure that there are people on the ground making sure that women can actually access these resources and aren't limited by things like long travel distances or family responsibilities, and are also actively benefiting from them. With more local organizations, this accountability lies in ensuring that the organization who receives the external funding is utilizing that funding sustainably. And once again, just to reemphasize, during times of conflict or political instability, this may be extremely difficult, but it's just as important.
As Eleanor was saying, it is critical to understand and include the intersectional lens when ensuring that these policies will benefit all women. As I briefly mentioned earlier, I looked at the cultural, caste, and religious intersections as a means of the prevalence and the underreporting of intimate partner violence and female literacy rate. And given the historical and current political climate in India, where caste and religious discrimination has been such a prevalent issue, occasionally ignored or even supported by government actors, discrimination against women, especially women of different religious, ethnic, and caste backgrounds, is a serious concern when discussing the implementation of these policies by specific government institutions. By incorporating the support of women-led civil society organizations in implementing these policies, we also give these organizations a platform to hold the government accountable to ensure that women of all backgrounds are benefiting from these policies, not just women of a certain religion or of a certain caste, because all women have a right to, one, an education, and two, to safety.
Yeah, I completely agree, especially with like my previous castmates' points on like how political instability or government pressure shouldn't be a barrier when it comes to like making sure these plans are sustainable. I feel like as long as women are centered whenever we are discussing these policies and they are a partner or even like the spearhead of these policies. In terms of metrics, it's usually an issue of like a lack of financial and land autonomy, especially in the case of my paper when it comes to the cocaine industry. A lot of these women are motivated by a lack of money, a lack of income. And then secondly, the others providing for these families. So if I were to establish certain metrics or certain like ways to evaluate, it would be through those two lenses. As for like the root issues, I would say a lot of issues like in terms of like what we can do from like an international standpoint even, and ensuring like we are helping to make sure like these plans stay in place, is allowing like us to platform these women in the way like if there's a cross boundary issue in the case that some of this like whether it be statewide or nationwide, we give women the platform to speak with other people from other countries so that they can collectively come together to come to these conclusions. That's one thing. And then our other, I'd say another like top down approach or something that we just need to be mindful of when we implement these plans or implement these programs or fund these programs is making sure the government does not become a deterrent. Like making and evaluating and creating metrics where the government has to meet them. Otherwise, they do not receive the funding because there has been a history of issues with government not holding it up on their end whenever it comes to a lot of times centering women or centering gendered issues. And so we have to be really deliberate about establishing like you're not getting funding or you're not getting this support in this capacity if you don't stick to your agreements.
Yeah, Autumn, I couldn't agree with you more about, the idea of just putting women at the forefront of everything we do. And, I want to touch more on the idea of the top-down approach that you briefly mentioned, because in my paper, I talk about that a bit in my stakeholder analysis. And dismantling that idea of the top-down approach that the IGOs and the governments are, all the decision makers and have all the authority. They do have a lot of influence and we need to collaborate with them and we need their support. But I think that restructuring the idea of collaboration is really important in accountability efforts. And I don't necessarily know if I agree with the terminology that I found, but an author that I cited in my research suggested a bottom-up approach. And I don't think women are at the bottom, but I like the idea of reversing those roles and putting women in the driver's seat and giving them a seat at the table as well, and making them the decision makers so that the solutions that we create with the resources we have are effective and they meet their needs. Because I mean, we can't say it enough that the women know what they need and they are our best tool and our best resource to funnel our resources that we have, our funds and our grants and our energy and time into these solutions.
Thank you so much, panelists, for your insights. I'm sure all our attendees appreciate your time and efforts on your papers. We would like to open the floor to our Q&A session. Feel free to write anything in the Q&A box. Yeah. if anybody prefers to talk instead, I can invite and you can talk instead of write in the box. But good job, guys. Like, that was amazing. Does anybody have questions for one another?
Feel free to contact any of us if you have individual questions about our process, our paper, our experience at GW. We're all open to like answering.
Okay, since there aren't any Q&A sessions, questions, and we have our emails on the slides here, I think we're gonna go ahead and end the panel. Thank you so much.